over Australia. And pay my respects on behalf of all of us to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Mike, can you go back to the first slide if that's okay, Mike? So just to check that you're in the right place, tonight is an information session to talk about DBT Intensive training and DBT Foundational training. So I'm Carla Walton, I'm clinical psychologist in Newcastle in New South Wales. And Mike Batchelor is also a clinical psychologist in Auckland, New Zealand. And the two of us are both two of the directors for DBT Training Australia. And we're holding this night to just give you a bit more information about what these trainings are and to answer your questions. So that's kind of, why we're here. So what we're going to do is record it. Oh, we're already recording. Okay, great. So that we can have this available for people that aren't here tonight so they can get the information if they couldn't make it. So Mike, I might get you to go down to the third slide now.
Oh. That one?
Thank you. Yeah. So also acknowledge that people with lived experience of mental ill health and recovery and the experiences of those people that support them, including carers, families and supporters. The voices of people with lived experience informs our work and is really why we're here. We recognise the vital contribution of lived experience at all levels and value the courage of those who share their unique perspective for the purpose of learning and growing together to achieve better outcomes for all. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so DBT, short for dialectical behaviour therapy, was originally developed for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. It's now been expanded to treating other disorders, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the original population that was developed for was people with borderline personality disorder. And DBT Intensive and Foundational training was created by the treatment development of DBT, Professor Marsha Linehan, after lots of iterations about trying to kind of find the most effective way to train clinicians in being able to deliver this therapy. So what we're going to talk about in the training that we deliver is something that's kind of had a lot of revisions so that it, it's just as useful as it can be, really. So DBT Intensive training is a team-based training because DBT is a team-based therapy. So we train the clinicians with the intention that that we're training them as a group, and that's how they'll be delivering the training. It's 10 days of training. There's a part 1 that's 5 days, and then a period in between of 6 months that involves some self-study and consultation. And Mike's going to tell you a little bit more about what happened in that 6 months. And then there's a second 5 days, which we call part 2. So 10 days training in total, and the part 1 and part 2 and the 6 months in between are all part of the whole kind of package of DBT intensive training. So in the part 1, in that first week, we're really teaching clinicians what they need to know to be able to deliver standard DBT. So the formats that we're using are like lecturing or didactic training, also experiential exercises. DBT has a philosophy that it's the therapist and the client are equals. And so we are training clinicians in some of the things that the way that we would be training clients, so that the learning isn't just didactic, but it's also at a more experiential level. We also show training videos from BTEC, which is the sort of international training company that Marsha Linehan founded. And so those videos are not available publicly, but are available for BTEC and BTEC affiliates, and DBT Training Australia is a BTEC affiliate. So we have access to those training videos. And then in the second part, each team presents their program and a clinical case. So the second part is very interactive and a chance to kind of help with the implementation piece of DBT. So in the first part, you get to learn really what DBT is and to be kind of pointing you towards helping your program get set up. And then in part 2, we're helping teams with the difficulties that they have with their programs and with their clinical work to really help to sustain your program. DBT is a resource-intensive treatment, and really any training is fairly resource-intensive, and so the training's developed to give your programs the best chance to survive. Now, DBT Foundational training, I have to say, when I first kind of came across DBT and DBT training, I was like, what is this thing? And it's not as kind of complicated as it sounds. it is essentially part one of DBT intensive training. But if you are already part of an intensively trained DBT team and your program's up and running, then you don't need to come to the full 10 days. So then you can just do what we call DBT Foundational training, which is the first part one of the DBT intensive. Teams can come and do a full intensive, and we have had teams do that where they choose to come for the full 10 days with the 6 months of self-study in between. But it's not necessary. So people can sign up for foundational training just as an individual clinician that is part of an intensively trained team. And Mike's going to talk a little bit more about some of the prerequisites and the process about how to go about that. And just broadly, it is quite an investment of time and money to do either intensive and foundational training. And just in terms of rationale for why you might bother doing that, there is research showing that teams have fairly reasonable rates of surviving when they go through intensive training. There's also Australian research from researchers in Queensland that therapists who are intensively trained have better clinical outcomes than those who aren't intensively trained. And there's more recent research from Melanie Harned and colleagues that those that have higher adherence to the treatment have better outcomes in terms of reduced suicide attempts and less dropout. So there's a number of kind of reasons why you might want to learn how to do the treatment as it's designed and have strong adherence to the treatment in terms of trying to get the good clinical outcomes that, of course, we all want for the people that we're seeing. Okay, thanks, Mike.
Oh, is that me?
It's you.
Okay,
yeah.
How about that? All right, so thanks, Carla. So part one, I'm going to pin myself just so that's kind of clear. Spotlight, whatever. All right, so I'm going to spotlight Carla and me. So part one is this kind of the learning the main fundamentals of the treatment. And then part two is reviewing how you've got on in terms of case and program. And program is a very important part of DBT. There are a lot of elements to the treatment, and there's a lot of, if you like, structures that you need to kind of set up and organize, such as your consultation team meetings, your intake processes, your actual skills group, of course. Everyone thinks skills. And there's a heck of a lot of work in that, actually, to get a program off the ground. So one of the things that we offer in this is a monthly or up to monthly maximum of 6 meetings with your team via Zoom to assist really in facing and overcoming the challenges that you might encounter in that. So the challenge is really just with respect to developing the structures of the treatment. There's challenges often with respect to implementing the treatment. And to be fair, there's also sometimes challenges in completing the tasks of the training. Now, the tasks of the training are very well specified, and they actually are steps towards implementation of the training. So the whole idea is that you do the steps of the training, whereas, for instance, you have to do case formulation, teach mindfulness, teach particular skill, etc., which are all, building on elements of the treatment. So quite a bit of work, and just like team is about building motivation and capability to do DBT, either Carla or myself, or perhaps one of our other trainers would join with your team monthly to support you in overcoming some of those challenges. Now, one thing to say is that teams are nominally for these consultations a team of 8 people. We do sometimes have smaller teams. Really, we might also have the occasional slightly larger team. And at times we might bundle up a couple of small teams into one meeting, and they become like a cohort and a larger team for consultation. It's actually quite useful because one of the good things about a DBT Intensive Part 2 is you hear how other people have overcome those challenges of implementation, and you can get these on these consultation teams as well. So that's a short version of the monthly Zoom consultations, which are included as part of, if you like, of the whole package, because that's the thing we find is most effective. Right, let me just move on. We will have time for questions about all this once we get through our little speeches. Right, so what do you need? Now, DBT is a fairly complicated treatment. I think it's fair to say there are many components of it, many modes, as we say. And this is what the data relates to, is providing what we call comprehensive DBT. That's DBT that is most likely to be effective around providing individual weekly sessions, skills groups, generalization typically or traditionally through FINE and the consultation team. Now, to come along to one of these intensive trainings to learn how to do that, the first thing you've already heard Carla say it, is that it's a team-based treatment. So our assumptions is that our requirements, in fact, is that you arrive as a team. A team is typically between 4 and 8 people. At a pinch, 3 people would be fine, 9 people would be fine. So if you don't quite fit the specification, let us know and we'll figure out how to make it work. I think the risks with very small teams is that all teams get attrition, people leave, things change, and you want to have a little bit of resilience in your numbers if you possibly can. So a few things here. It's 4 to 8 people. It's about progressing. Your goals would have to be to implement comprehensive DBT, and it's in this team structure. Now, the thing about comprehensive DBT is important to us because I think there's a kind of discourse these days that DBT is just about skills. Now, skills is one of the change strategies, and change strategies are one of the set of strategies in DBT, and skills group is one of the modes of DBT. So in fact, comprehensive DBT is the treatment that's associated with the data, which is why we're all here. And we hold very dear to that we want to help you to implement comprehensive DBT rather than what we'd call a partial implementation. There may be scope for that, but that's not the focus of this training. Now, to register, because it's a bit of a rigmarole, let's be honest. There's more straightforward trainings to go to. What we ask you to do is email us and we'll send you a registration code. That's so we can just have a preliminary discussion to see that, yeah, you've got 4 to 8 people-ish. You're committed to the whole process. We'll send you a code and then you sign people up. We ask for a team lead or team liaison role, so a primary point of contact for us as trainers, because we're together for a period of 6 or 7 months with you as you build this program, and we provide these elements of the treatment. And we want someone who can be a lead on that. That person also signs your team up through our online process, and then each team member signs themselves up. We ask you to do that so we get a lot of information about you, your clinical experience and your work context, so we can tailor and consider the people at the training, their needs, and we can be more responsive to that through that information. Now, there is a situation where some people want to come to a DBT intensive training. They're committed to figuring out how to develop and implement a comprehensive treatment, but they haven't got a team. So one of the options that we're experimenting with on this training is if people are in that situation, there's 1 or perhaps 2 of you, and you want to form a team with others for the duration of this training, then let us know. And if we have numbers and people are in the right sort of scopes, we'll try and join you together and see if that's going to work out for you. So we won't be taking an active role and helping you to form the team, but we're kind of like matchmaking, is probably better terms for it, but where we can kind of put you together to see if you think it's going to work for the purposes of the training. It's probably good if you spend a little bit of time before the training, actually meeting online. It's probably helpful if you're in a similar scope of practice. Like if someone was in, say, child and adolescent or in for mental health and someone else was in forensics, it would be hard to see. You might not understand each other's worlds. So the closer your scope of practice, the better. But I have to say, in our modern world, a lot of teams are forming across different work locations and points of geography and coming together just for the purpose of delivering the treatment rather than having any collegial kind of water cooler conversations being in the same office. So how do we think about that? Now, Carla's already said that foundational training is for individuals rather than teams. And its scenario is because people leave, they change work, they go off and do other things. So teams, when they've been established for a while, often have a need to recruit new people into their team and they want to get them comprehensively trained. So if that's your situation, you need a foundational training in our book. Now, the requirements of that is your team is intensively trained through a behavior tech or affiliated training program. Now, I'm not sure how well that's going to fit with some people from their background training, but again, we're following, I guess, the behavior tech specification and the framework that's been developed by Marshall Lanahan. And our view is this is the gold standard approach, so we're going to stick to it. And what we can be assured of when people have gone through a behavior tech training is that they've been basically trained in comprehensive implementation of the treatment. So we have a team that has a starting point that we can rely on. So if you're a new member of such a team, nominally 50% or more of your team would still be there from the comprehensive training. Sometimes in the life cycle of teams, that isn't the case anymore, because over time there might be a number of foundationals. So again, we have to consider that. And you need within that team a mentor. Now, a mentor is someone who can help you overcome and support you with the challenges of the training, i.e. the implementation. And that person needs to be someone who's been in the team a couple of years, received comprehensive training, could be foundational or intensive, or another category could be if they're LBC certified. So LBC is Linehan Board of Certification, or DBT LBC. There are actually only, I think, about half a dozen or less people currently located in Australia who are LBC. But again, that's a measure that that person probably knows what they're talking about. And so that would be a good person for you to have as a mentor. If you have all those ducks lined up, you just log into the internet and fill out the form and make your application. So that's the basic requirement. Okay, there's a scenario of what do you need to do to get ready for this training? And I think the first thing is that there's a bit of research around that behavior tech did over time of essentially who translates training into implementation and who doesn't quite get the traction. And the people who were more likely, the teams who are more likely to implement treatments were those who started soon rather than later. Now, I've seen this myself, that sometimes there's always a good reason to do things later, right? Because in the later, you're going to be more ready, you're going to have more time, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. What that translates into is that people empirically are less likely to implement the treatment. So we say start soon. Now, the first thing you can do in terms of starting is read the core texts. It is, if you like, a requirement of coming to the training that you read these texts. And if you read these texts, especially Linehan 1993, that's the red and black one at the top on the screen there, and the Skills Training Manual, 2nd edition, 2015, that's a solid description of the treatment that is currently and probably will always be the definition of DBT around which the treatment was evaluated. If you want to slip into that in a somewhat more gentle manner, Kelly Kerner's book, Doing DBT, slightly obscured on my screen. It's got the tree and the brown bit on it. It's a very easy read. I sometimes have described that as a fireside read. Whereas when you meet chapter 3 of Marsha's core text, that's not a fireside read. It's a Panadol read. But it's very comprehensive. And of course, Michaela Swales and Heidi Hurd, a book that is actually my favorite go-to as an introduction to DBT, is this Distinctive Features series. You see it in the purple there. Another thing you could start to do is get your team going. Now, a team meets weekly, typically 90 minutes. Some teams crimp that back to an hour. Good luck to you, you're going to be busy. Your task is to start to developing the structures and processes around it, as well as consulting and formulating cases within that. Jennifer Sayers' book, down there on the bottom right-hand side, DBT Teams, is the current go-to for the description of teams, how to set them up, how to make them work, the do's, the don'ts. So there's some very good reading there that you could do that would put you in very good stead. Now, there's a debate between self-study, come to the training, and then start the practice, or start some elements of the practice first. I don't have a firm opinion on that. If you're already operating and providing elements of DBT and you want to come to the intensive training to sharpen that up a little bit more, then you can also just continue with what you're doing and make sure that you've covered the scope of these texts here to see how you can go. So this is some tips on getting ready for the training. And the more preparation you do, the more it will help. It's very clear to me that, very much in the spirit of, I guess, mindfulness and Zen, that is the roots of mindfulness and DBT. This training is about taking you to the next level. And the further up that level you are in terms of your knowledge and practice of DBT, the further we're going to assist you in developing your implementation. So start soon, people.
I understand that sort of dialectical point there that my own experience and that of many people I've talked to is in reading these texts before they came, it helped a little bit, but they didn't really kind of get what the treatment was. And it was really when they came to face-to-face training that it just made sense and fell into place. So
kind of goes together,
I guess on the other side of that is we would encourage people to read and also to not be too concerned if you feel like you're not really understanding it, because that just kind of seems to make more sense when you actually come to a training.
I think it's a good point, especially Master's 93 text. The second half of it is a lot of kind of checklists. What do you do in this situation? What do you do in that situation? So if you're not really providing the treatment, it feels less relevant, but the first 3 chapters are very foundational. Okay, I'm going to move us on. So look, we had a bunch of questions that came in via the survey from Spectrum. Thank you for doing that. And we've clustered those up, and we'll make a few comments about those, and then we're going to open the floor, so to speak, in the chat for any questions that you might have. There's questions about the from a DBT perspective, what can we offer in terms of supporting families? I'll speak to that briefly. There's 2 things, and there's 2 different approaches to this. One that's pretty clear in DBT, that the family is primarily the environment. It would be that from a DBTA perspective or an adult perspective, and that a lot of our work with families is really supporting them and getting them all to be more skillful and reinforcing the behaviors that you want more of in the person's environment. That is to say, is primarily focused around the needs of the quotes index client rather than being family therapy per se. And we can talk about that. I'm absolutely sure we will talk about that more in the trainings, because routinely, or actually to be fair, semi-routinely, I will have families involved in the care of my DBT clients. Another approach is what's in it just for the families. And I think the current format that is most responsive and effective with evidence base is that developed by Alan Frizzetti and Perry Hoffman, called Family Connections. Now, Family Connections is a 12-week volunteer-led family support program. It's manualized. It starts with a lot of psychoeducation, moves into the skills of validation, and then it belatedly gets to problem solving once people can actually listen and understand each other's point of view. I think it is the current go-to in terms of family support models. I know it operates in some parts of Australia. I actually know one of my colleagues, not from DBT New Zealand, but another forum is going to be joining with some Australian colleagues shortly to try and provide more training for trainers over there. So if you have family members who need support, and we acknowledge straight off the bat that the problems that our clients have are also very stressful for families, then I'd recommend that you search out Family Connections in your locale and think about whether you can get connected to even consider providing family connections in your region as a clinician, because it's undoubtedly super helpful. All right, adaptations. Now, this is how it works in DBT. The DBT Intensive training trains you in the core treatment. It's primarily a treatment that's been structured around people with complex multi-diagnostic or multi-problem, difficult to treat presentations characterized by emotion dysregulation, impulsivity, risk, etc. That is the core treatment. Then that treatment has been adapted to how do you provide this treatment to adolescents? How do you provide this treatment to people with eating disorders, corrections, etc. So from this lens, this is the core treatment. Now, DBTA, DBT for adolescents, Rathos and Miller, Miller and Rathos, etc., is, if you like, an adaptation. It has a slightly different skills curriculum. It has slightly different structures around the treatment, and yet it is the same treatment. So we will make reference to DBTA. I mean, Carla and I both work primarily in the adult sector. I have been involved in a research trial with adolescents and their families. And so we will talk to that during our training. The degree to which depends on who enrolls for the training. There's a lot of adolescent clinicians. We're going to spend more time on it. If there aren't, we'll spend less time on it. And we have the option in the second part of the training is also drawing in some of our other colleagues who have well-established expertise in DBT with adolescents and their families, and making quite a slot out of that if we like. So we'll consider it as a way of implementing and adapting the core of the treatment, and that's the thing you've got to learn first. Okay, I'm going to sub back to you, Carla, so you can talk a bit about those other adaptations and topics.
It's probably similar, the adaptations to DBTA. So in terms of eating disorders or applying DBT in corrections or residential settings, there is a core of the treatment which you need to learn, and then the adaptations kind of based on a knowledge of the core treatment. So the core treatment is what we would teach in part 1, so that first 5 days of intensive, or the foundational if people are already in intensive teams that are intensively trained. And then we can focus more on the adaptations in the part 2, depending on what people's settings are. So we're fortunate enough that we have colleagues that are with a high level of kind of training experience, but also clinical experience that we could call on to, support people in the part 2 training if needed for DBT-A or eating disorders. So it really depends who's there, kind of like where that conversation goes, but we would be aiming to have interactions that were kind of tailored for the settings that people are in and useful in expanding their skills in that area. There are also other trainings that over time that we might offer separate from the intensive that are more specialised in DBT-A or eating disorders. So that's it for adaptations. There was a question about culturally safe practice in DBT, and I've recently reviewed the literature, and we don't currently have anything in the Australian context that talks about how to adapt DBT for our First Nations people. It is something that I've, as part of a research project I'm doing, have spent time talking about with First Nations clinicians that are doing DBT, and the need for us to look at how we make some adaptations to make it more culturally responsive. And there's a research project that I'm just beginning that will be partnering with First Nations clinicians across Australia to look at what adaptations we need. So I don't have answers yet, but I would hope in the next few years that we'll have some published information for people about how we can ensure that the treatment we're delivering is culturally safe for our First Nations people. In terms of, we got a few general comments, we'll just kind of touch on those, how to support BPD clients. I guess we're focusing tonight on DBT intensive training and foundational training, which is as it's called, intensive training. So it's fairly resource demanding training if you want to set up a DBT program. But you can also access all kinds of other training for BPD. Spectrum have a whole range of courses that they offer about working with BPD clients. So it'd be worth looking at their website to just look at what your needs are and what might fit for that. So courses that are less intensive in time than the courses that we're talking about tonight. In terms of DBT by telehealth, up until the pandemic started, there was really no literature about that. In the past few years, there's been a number of papers come out that are really qualitative research that about sort of lessons learned from people that are doing it. So there'd be between 5 and 10 of those papers out there now. To date, there's no randomized trial looking at what the outcomes are like of DBT delivered over telehealth. So there's a lot of people that have sort of done it and have anecdotal experience, but we don't have sort of really firm evidence. There is one paper that's just come in press this week that myself and some colleagues have published looking at attendance levels in DBT compared with face-to-face in Australia and New Zealand DBT programs. And I'll just pop that link in the chat if anyone's interested. And then dealing with crises is something that would be kind of covered in a DBT intensive program, but it would also be covered in many other training courses that are offered by Spectrum as well. So it really depends on where you are and what your needs are. There'll be options to cover that, but it may be the intensive, or that may just be more intensive than what you need and what you're looking for. So recommend, and perhaps one of the staff here from Spectrum will just put the kind of link in the chat for people to be able to see those other courses that are available. I think lastly, just apologies to the Tassie clinicians that we didn't offer a drop-down option for your state. It's not that you're not important to us, and that was just a bit of an oversight. And so I think that's hopefully we've either answered your questions in terms of weaving them in as we've gone through throughout the kind of presentation or at the end, but we're really open to having a chance to interact with you about the things that have, that you want to ask that have come up in what we've talked about so far or that you've arrived with. So maybe if you use your